I have been a die-hard sports guy for as long as I can remember. Basketball, loved it. Football, let's go. Soccer, bring it. I wasn't good enough to go pro. Too many missed free throws and way too many sprained ankles. But that never stopped me from loving the game. So, when I saw a job opening at the local Nike warehouse, it felt like destiny. What better way to stay connected to sports than working for the company that made the shoes I had been obsessing over since I could dribble a basketball? The warehouse was only 20 minutes from my apartment, and the pay was surprisingly good. My mom joked it was about time I found something better than a delivery gig that barely paid my phone bill. My dad, well, let's just say he was still bitter I didn't follow in his footsteps to become an electrician. At least you're finally getting benefits, he grumbled when I told him it wasn't just about the money. But Nike was Nike, the swoosh, the history. I'd get discounts on gear, and who knows, maybe even meet some cool people. It felt like a step up, like I was finally moving forward after a few too many years of figuring things out. But on my first day on the job, that's when I started realizing something was a little off. It started small, quirky even. The warehouse manager, a wiry guy named Pete with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, handed me a clipboard with a smirk that screamed, "You're new? Let's see how you survive the circus." The job was straightforward enough. Stack boxes, sort shipments, and try not to lose your mind. Except there was this list at the bottom of the clipboard, printed in bold. Warehouse rules. If you hear footsteps on the second floor, ignore them. The second floor has been sealed off for years. Always double-check the laces on shoes in aisle 17. If you see a mannequin with its arms raised, notify Pete immediately. The lights will flicker at 11:11 p.m. Stand still until they stop. Under no circumstances should you wear the display shoes. I laughed out loud when I read it. Is this a joke? I asked Pete. His smirk disappeared faster than a sprinter in vaporflies. Just follow the rules, he said, patting me on the shoulder before walking off. Okay, so maybe the warehouse had a weird sense of humor. No big deal. The first few hours were easy enough. I got into a rhythm, stacking boxes, humming to the beat of whatever pop song the overhead speakers were blasting. It almost felt like a gym workout, except without the satisfaction of a good bench press. Then came the mannequins. Now, I've never been a fan of mannequins. Something about their blank stares always gave me the creeps. But aisle 12 was full of them, dressed head to toe in the latest Nike gear. Each one frozen mid-pose like they were starring in an Instagram reel. I swear one of them turned its head slightly when I walked by, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Long day, right? By the time my lunch break rolled around, I had almost forgotten about the rules. I sat in the break room, scrolling through my phone and munching on the world's driest ham sandwich. Pete was there too, sipping coffee like it was the only thing keeping him alive. "Hey," I said, trying to make conversation. "What's up with that list?" "The rules, I mean." Pete stared at me over his coffee cup, his eyes narrowing. "You're better off not asking too many questions," he said. "Just follow them. Trust me." Pete didn't seem like the kind of guy you push for answers. The real fun began later that night, around 10:45 p.m. I was in aisle 17, stacking boxes of running shoes. I bent down to grab another box, and when I stood up, I noticed where the shoes on a display rack had its laces tied in a perfect bow. The thing is, I was 100% certain I hadn't tied them. I looked around, half expecting one of my coworkers to pop out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the aisle was empty. I reached out to untie the laces because, rule number 2, and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. Before I could think too much about it, the lights flickered. My phone buzzed in my pocket. 11:11 p.m. stand still. I muttered to myself, remembering rule number 4. And I did, for what felt like an eternity. I stood frozen in the middle of aisle 17, clutching a box of shoes. The lights flickered on and off, faster and faster, casting weird shadows that danced along the shelves. I could have sworn I heard faint whispers, but when I strained to listen, they disappeared. When the lights finally steadied, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. "What the hell?" I muttered, shaking my head. That's when I noticed a mannequin at the end of the aisle. It wasn't there before. Its arms were raised, as if it were celebrating some invisible victory. I blinked a few times, hoping the mannequin would magically go back to wherever it came from. It didn't. It just stood there, arms raised in some kind of triumphant pose. It was like it had just won the Boston Marathon. "Okay, Jesse, you're just tired," I told myself, laughing nervously. I turned away and pretended it wasn't there. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Except when I turned back, it was closer. Not a lot closer, just a few feet, but enough to make my heart jump into my throat. I froze, gripping the box of shoes like it was some kind of weapon. "Pete!" I called out. My voice echoed in the empty aisle. No answer. The mannequin didn't move, but the longer I stared at it, the more unsettling it became. Its plastic face was eerily detailed, right down to the faint indentations where cheekbones should be. The Nike hoodie it wore looked brand new, the tag still dangling from the sleeve. And then I remembered rule number 3. If you see a mannequin with its arms raised, notify Pete immediately. I didn't need to be told twice. Dropping the box, I bolted for the break room. My sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as I ran, my breath coming in short bursts. When I burst into the break room, Pete was still there, sipping his never-ending cup of coffee. He looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What's the rush?" he asked. There's a mannequin in aisle 17. I panted. Its arms are up. I think it moved. Pete's face darkened. He set his coffee down and stood up, moving with the kind of speed that said he'd done this before. "Stay here," he ordered. "Wait, what are you going to do?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Pete didn't answer. He just grabbed a flashlight from a locker and strode out of the room. I stood there, feeling like a kid left alone after a scary bedtime story. The break room suddenly felt too quiet. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound, and even that seemed unnaturally loud. I glanced at the clock, 11:18 p.m. The shift wasn't even halfway over. Minutes passed, then more. Pete didn't come back. I debated going after him, but quickly dismissed the idea. If Pete was dealing with whatever that was, I didn't want to get in his way. Instead, I sat down at the table and tried to distract myself by scrolling through Instagram. A video of some guy dunking in a pair of Air Jordans came up, and for a moment, I almost forgot about the mannequin. Almost. Then the break room lights flickered. I froze, staring at the ceiling as the fluorescent bulbs buzzed and dimmed. My phone screen went black. "Not again," I whispered. I stood up, my chair scraping across the floor. The bottle hit the floor loudly, and the flickering stopped, but now the break room felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the shadows in the corner seemed darker than they should have been. I grabbed the nearest object for self-defense, a half-empty bottle of Gatorade, and inched toward the door. The hallway outside was pitch black, except for the faint glow of an exit sign in the distance. "Pete!" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. My sneakers squeaked again, but this time the sound felt deafening. I made my way toward aisle 17, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and run. When I reached the aisle, it was empty. The mannequin was gone. I let out a shaky laugh. "See? Just your imagination," I said, trying to convince myself. But then I noticed a shoe display. The laces were tied again in perfect bows on every single pair. I hadn't done that. My stomach dropped. Something moved in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was still empty. "Pete, this isn't funny." I shouted, my voice echoing. A whisper answered me, soft, almost playful, but definitely not human. "Don't wear them." I backed away, bumping into a shelf. A box tumbled to the floor, spilling its contents. A single sneaker rolled out, its swoosh glinting under the dim light. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't wear them." My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I turned and ran, sprinting down the aisles without looking back. I didn't stop until I was back in the break room, slamming the door shut behind me. Pete was there, sitting at the table like nothing had happened. His coffee cup was full again. "Where the hell were you?" I yelled, my voice cracking. Pete looked up, his expression calm. Too calm. Relax, he said. I took care of it. What does that mean? I demanded. What's going on here? Pete sighed, leaning back in his chair. I told you to follow the rules. You'll be fine as long as you do that. Fine. I laughed hysterically. Dude, there's something in this warehouse. The mannequins are moving, the shoes. Interruption. It's been like this for years. That shut me up. Pete stood and walked over to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. Look, Jesse, you seem like a good guy, so I'm going to give you some advice. Don't ask too many questions, and whatever you do, don't break the rules. I didn't sleep much after that first shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mannequin's blank face and the way it seemed to inch closer without moving. Pete's words echoed in my head like a bad song on repeat. Don't break the rules. Easy for him to say. He'd probably been dealing with this for years. Years. Me? I was already questioning if I'd survive another night. But quitting wasn't an option. My rent wasn't going to pay itself, and my younger brother Malik looked up to me. He was a high school track star, and I'd been helping him save up for a new pair of running spikes. Working at Nike wasn't just about the paycheck or my love for sports. It was about showing Malik that hard work paid off, even if that work was in a haunted warehouse. The next night, I walked into the building with a forced grin, determined to act like everything was normal. Pete greeted me at the entrance, clipboard in hand, ready for round 2. He asked, smirking, "Do I have a choice?" I shot back, trying to keep my tone light. "Do I?" Pete chuckled but didn't answer. Instead, he handed me the clipboard and walked off. As I scanned the list of tasks for the night, my eyes drifted to the rules at the bottom. They were the same as before, bold and unyielding. If you hear footsteps on the second floor, ignore them. Always double-check the laces on shoes in aisle 17. If you see a mannequin with its arms raised, notify Pete immediately. The lights will flicker at 11:11 p.m. Stand still until they stop. Under no circumstances should you wear the display shoes. I sighed and headed toward aisle 17, determined to stay ahead of whatever nightmare awaited me. The air felt heavier tonight, like the warehouse itself knew I was back. As I worked, I tried to focus on the mundane. Stacking boxes, checking inventory, humming my favorite basketball hype songs. It worked for a while. The first 2 hours passed without incident. No mannequins, no flickering lights. Just me in the soothing rhythm of mindless labor. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. Faint footsteps echoing above me. I froze, the clipboard slipping from my hand. My heart thudded in my chest as I looked up at the ceiling. The second floor had been sealed off, Pete had said, but the sound of someone or something walking above me was unmistakable. Rule number 1. If you hear footsteps on the second floor, ignore them. Easy for you to say. I muttered under my breath. My instinct screamed at me to investigate, but I stayed put, gripping the edge of the shelf for support. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving directly above me before stopping. I held my breath, waiting for... I didn't know what to think when nothing happened. I exhaled shakily and went back to work, pretending I hadn't heard anything. But the silence that followed was worse. It pressed in around me, amplifying every creak of the shelves and every rustle of cardboard. I made it aisle 17 without further incident, but the moment I stepped into a familiar row of running shoes, I felt again that inexplicable chill, like someone had cranked the AC just for me. The laces on the display shoes were tied again, each not as perfect as if it had been done by a machine. Seriously, I muttered, crouching down to untie them. My hands trembled as I worked, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every second. And then I saw it, a shadow move at the far end of the aisle. Not a mannequin this time, but something else. Something taller, with long, spindly limbs and a gait that didn't look human. My blood turned to ice as it disappeared around the corner. "Pete!" I shouted, bolting upright. My voice echoed, but there was no response. Gripping the clipboard like a weapon, I backed out of the aisle, keeping my eyes on the corner where the shadow had vanished. My heart hammered in my chest, and I was pretty sure I was sweating through my shirt. I turned to run, only to slam straight into Pete. "Whoa, easy," he said, grabbing my shoulders to steady me. There's something here, I stammered. Not a mannequin. Something else. It was in aisle 17. Pete's expression darkened, but he didn't seem surprised. Did you break any rules? No. I mean, I don't think so. I stopped, remembering the footsteps. Okay, maybe I hesitated on rule 1. Pete shook his head. The rules aren't suggestions, Jesse. They're there for a reason. Yeah, well, maybe you could explain that reason. I shot back. What the hell is going on here? Pete hesitated, his jaw tightening. This place. It's been like this for as long as I've worked here. Something about the shoes, the mannequins. It attracts things. Things we don't understand. The rules keep us safe. Safe? I laughed bitterly. Right. Because standing still while the lights flicker and pretending not to hear ghostly footsteps is the definition of safety. Before I could argue further, the lights above us flickered once, then twice. Stay still, Pete hissed. I didn't need to be told twice. We both froze, standing in the middle of the aisle like statues. The lights flickered faster, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, for the briefest moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back, Pete and I were alone, but the shoe display was empty. What happened to the shoes? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Pete didn't answer right away. He was staring at the empty display, his face pale and tight, like someone who had just gotten bad news from a doctor. When he finally turned to me, his voice was low and tense. They've moved. Moved. I repeated. Shoes don't just move on their own. Here they do. Pete rubbed his temples, looking like he regretted every life choice that had brought him to this warehouse. This is bad, Jesse. Really bad. Before I could ask what the hell he meant by that, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. It came from somewhere deep in a maze of aisles, the sound of shelves toppling over. My heart jumped into my throat. What was that? I asked, gripping the clipboard tighter like it was some kind of shield. Them, Pete said grimly. They're looking for a host. A host? I repeated, my stomach twisting. Pete, what are you talking about? Pete gave me a long, hard look. You need to stay calm and listen carefully. Whatever you do, don't put on the shoes. I laughed nervously, the sound hollow in the cavernous silence of the warehouse. Why would I put on the shoes? That's like rule number 5. Good. Pete nodded, his jaw tight. Because once they find a host, they don't let go. My brain was working overtime, trying to process what he was saying. Shoes didn't need hosts. Shoes didn't move or disappear or cause eerie footsteps on sealed-off floors. This had to be some elaborate prank, or maybe I was losing my mind. Another crash rang out, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Pete grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the break room. We need to stick together, he said. If we're lucky, they'll settle down by morning. Lucky? I yanked my arm free, glaring at him. Pete, I don't even know what's going on. You're telling me the shoes are alive, possessed? What? Pete sighed, looking more exhausted than ever. They're not alive. Not exactly. They're cursed, I guess you could say. A long time ago, something bad happened here. People say it left a mark on the warehouse, on the shoes, even on the mannequins. And ever since then, strange things have been happening. Strange things. I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Like disappearing shoes and murderous mannequins? You think this is a joke? Pete snapped, his eyes blazing. Do you know how many people have quit, or worse, because they didn't follow the rules? The air between us felt electric, charged with unspoken tension. Before I could respond, the lights flickered again. My phone buzzed in my pocket. 11:11 p.m. stand still. Pete hissed. I didn't argue. We both froze, listening to the sound of dragging footsteps coming closer and closer. The shadows in the room shifted, twisting like smoke. My chest tightened as a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, a tall, distorted shape that didn't move like a person. The light stopped flickering, and the figure was gone. Let's go, Pete said, his voice sharp. He grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to follow. Where are we going? I whispered, my legs shaky as I trail behind him. To find the shoes, Pete said grimly. If we don't, they'll keep hunting. Hunting. My voice cracked. Hunting what? Pete stopped and turned to me, his face lit eerily by the flashlight. Us. My stomach churned, but I nodded, forcing myself to keep moving. I continued moving, navigating the aisles with my legs stiff and my steps hesitant. The only sound filling the air was the shallow, panicked breaths I could barely control and the occasional creak of the metal shelves. Every few moments, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting between racks, a fleeting flash of white that vanished before I could focus on it. Then we found them. The shoes were arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of aisle 9. Their laces were tied in intricate, almost impossible patterns, far too elaborate to have been done by human hands. The air around them felt heavy, thick with energy I could not explain. Pete knelt down, muttering something under his breath, too quietly for me to hear. It sounded like a prayer, or perhaps a curse. What now? I asked, my voice trembling. Stay back, Pete ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. He slowly extended his hand, hovering it just above the nearest pair of shoes. That was when the shoes moved. They didn't just twitch or slide. They shot into the air, their laces flailing wildly like snakes. Pete jumped back with a sharp curse, and I stumbled into a shelf, knocking over a stack of boxes. The shoes hovered for a moment, suspended in the air, then shot toward us like missiles. Run, Pete shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. We tore down the aisle, the sound of the shoes' laces whipping through the air behind us. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I kept running, my mind screaming one desperate thought. Get out, get out, get out. We burst into the break room, slamming the door shut behind us. Pete grabbed a chair and shoved it under the handle, breathing hard. What the hell was that? I yelled, my voice shaking with fear. They're restless, Pete said, his face pale. Something stirred them up. Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered again. The door handle began to rattle violently, the chair creaking under the pressure of whatever was outside. Pete and I backed away, holding our breath, as the room felt like it was closing in on us. What stirred them up? I demanded, panic rising in my voice. What do they want? Pete didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the door, then to me, as if he was weighing some heavy, awful truth he didn't want to speak aloud. I grabbed his arm, shaking him. Pete, what's going on? They want a host, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. A host? I repeated, my stomach twisting with dread. What are you talking about? Pete met my eyes. If they can latch onto a person, they'll stop for a while at least. My stomach dropped. What happens to the host? Pete looked away, his face grim. You don't want to know. For a moment, there was only silence. The door handle rattled again, then stopped. The warehouse outside felt suffocatingly quiet. Then a soft, deliberate knock came from the door. Jesse, a voice called, faint and almost melodic, but unmistakably human. My blood turned to ice. Did you hear that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Pete nodded, grim. Don't answer it. Rule number 6. There is no rule 6, I hissed. There is now, Pete muttered. The knock came again, louder this time. Jesse, the voice repeated, stretching my name like a taunt. You left your shoes. I looked down at my feet. My sneakers were still on, perfectly tied. I hadn't touched the cursed shoes, but it felt as if they had touched me. My head swam with the memory of those laces, tied in aisle 17 by unseen hands. I shuddered. The door handle rattled again, violently, then went still. Pete motioned for me to stay quiet, pressing his finger to his lips. We waited, the silence stretching out into an eternity. Then a low, dragging sound began, moving from the door and slowly fading into the distance. Pete exhaled shakily, slumping against the table. They're gone, he said, though his voice carried little relief. For now. For now. I muttered. Great. We sat in silence for a while. The tension was thick enough to choke on. My mind raced with everything that had happened. the footsteps, the mannequins, the cursed shoes. It all felt like a bad dream, but the ache in my legs and the sweat soaking my shirt told me otherwise. Why do you stay here? I asked finally. Why not just quit? Pete gave a bitter laugh. You think I haven't tried? This place doesn't let you go, Jesse. Once you're part of it, you're part of it. The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. Was I stuck here too? Was this my life now? Dodging cursed sneakers and haunted mannequins until I couldn't anymore? Before I could spiral any further, the lights in the break room flickered once. Pete and I both froze, staring at the ceiling. The flicker didn't last long, just a single pulse of light, but it was enough to send my heart racing.